Tonight at 10, a ceasefire brokered by the Americans and Russians has come into force in Syria. President Assad, despite his outward defiance today, is said to accept the terms of the deal. We have an exclusive report on life inside Aleppo, where there's a glimmer of hope after a prolonged siege.
It's been a long, hot and dangerous summer in Aleppo, and you can see it in the fabric of the city, the damage that's been done. The ceasefire is meant to stop all of that.
We'll be asking if the ceasefire is likely to hold, as more talks are now being planned. Also tonight, barely 2 months after he left Number 10, David Cameron decides it's now time to leave the House of Commons.
As a former Prime Minister, it is very difficult, I think, to sit as a backbencher and not be an enormous diversion and distraction from what the government's doing. I don't want to be that distraction.
The government's plans for new grammar schools in England have been set out by ministers, but they've caused a deep divide in opinion. Hillary Clinton is being treated for pneumonia. Her opponents insist health is now an issue in the presidential campaign.
Welcome to the Great British Bake Off.
And one of the BBC's most successful and popular programmes is moving to Channel 4.
In the south, crowdfunding commuters hoping to take legal action over the crisis at Southern Rail. And the teacher from Bournemouth in detention in Bangkok because of a mark on his passport.
Good evening. The ceasefire in Syria, brokered by Russia and the USA, came into force about 6 hours ago. It's probably the last chance to obtain peace in a united Syria, according to John Kerry, the US Secretary of State. Russia has promised that its ally, President Assad of Syria, will respect the truce, but several rebel groups have demanded guarantees because they fear they will still be targeted by Assad's forces. Now, during the day, there's been more fighting in the northern city of Aleppo. Our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, travelled there today, and he sent us this report.
The further you drive north in Syria, the more intense the war becomes. This road is the regime's fragile link between Damascus and Aleppo. Rebels cut it this summer where it reaches the Aleppo suburbs. They were only driven back by Syrian troops at the weekend. Shelling was still going on as we drove in, government artillery hitting rebel positions. It's been a long, hot and dangerous summer in Aleppo, and you can see it in the fabric of the city, the damage that's been done. The ceasefire is meant to stop all of that. Since the fighting started here in 2012, the west side of the city has been in government hands. Armed opposition groups control the east. 4 years of fighting have devastated Aleppo. This gives an idea of the firepower of the Syrian army and its Russian backers who've been making gains around Aleppo. One of the big questions about the ceasefire is whether they're prepared to give their enemies a chance to rest and regroup. On the rebel side, there are also doubts. Groups backed by the Americans have been told they have to separate from more radical militias, who they regard as allies. And another important rebel group, Aqra al-Sham, which is backed by Saudi Arabia, has already rejected the ceasefire agreement.
The deal that was announced between the US and Russia to resolve the issue in Syria does not achieve, in our view, the basic minimum goals set by our avenging people. They will lose all their sacrifices and gains.
In Damascus, President Bashar al-Assad chose to celebrate the Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha by visiting and praying in the suburb of Daraya. It was in rebel hands for 5 years until they surrendered at the end of August after what the UN called an unrelenting siege. President Assad's government has backed the ceasefire, but his words suggested that he has unfinished military business.
The Syrian state is determined to recover all areas from the terrorists, to restore security, to rebuild the infrastructure and everything else that was destroyed in both human and material aspects. We came here today to replace the fake freedom that they tried to promote at the beginning of the crisis, like in Daraya, with the real freedom.
People are used to war here. The holiday is being celebrated even though there was a steady thunder of artillery fire throughout the day. The ceasefire agreement is complicated, potentially fragile, and all sides in the war doubt whether it can work. But it's all the diplomats have. At the very least, it might be a respite for the people who need one most. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Aleppo.
Well, today's ceasefire does not include jihadist groups such as so-called Islamic State. On Syria's border with Turkey, another battle for control is taking place as Free Syrian Army soldiers, backed by Turkish troops, have been battling to take territory back from IS. Turkey is hoping to establish a 70-mile zone with no IS presence along the Syrian side of the border, while also excluding any Kurdish fighters. Recent military action has been around the town of Jarablus. Our correspondent Mark Lowen and cameraman Gökte Koraltan are among the first Western journalists to reach that town, and they've sent us this report.
A month ago, they'd have been killed for doing this. But now Jarablus is free from so-called Islamic State, and they're savouring it. Rebel soldiers, supported by Turkey, took back the Syrian border town after 3 years, and we were taken in to see it. 20,000 refugees have returned to the jihadists' former stronghold. But the shadow of IS will be hard to erase, a brutal time when enemies were executed at these posts for all to see. Aisha Al-Amin was forced to bear witness. Her son was beheaded by IS, who then brought his head to her. We lived here in a prison, she says. We couldn't leave or talk to anyone. They forced us to cover up and stay inside. Now we're liberated. Turkey was once a reluctant partner in the anti-IS coalition, but it led the rebels this time, both seizing the chance to hit Kurdish fighters too, who they see as a threat. A rebel commander tells me they're aiming to retake the capital of the so-called IS Caliphate.
There is no difference between IS and Kurdish militia. They're both terrorist organizations. Now we have won back Jarablus, we feel confident and capable of beating IS. We will go towards Raqqa and liberate all Syrian land.
Turkey has managed to, in effect, get here what it has long called for, a de facto safe zone, pushing IS out, but just as importantly for Turkey, keeping Kurdish fighters away, allowing refugees to come back here to Jarablus. Turkey now feels emboldened by this operation and says it will push on into other IS strongholds. The militants are excluded from this ceasefire. The battle against IS will intensify if that ceasefire elsewhere holds. There is still nervousness here, ID checks amidst rumours of sleeper cells. But life is returning to Jarablus, and the momentum is building to crush Islamic State. Mark Lowen, BBC News, Jarablus, northern Syria.
Let's talk about the situation tonight with our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. Let's talk about this ceasefire, James. What's the assessment about how robust it's likely to be?
Well, tonight, Hugh, John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, said that the deal that he brokered with the Russians is by no means perfect. He was very open about that. But he also said, look, this is, in his view, maybe the last chance to save a united Syria. The problem is we've had ceasefires before in Syria, and they haven't always lasted. And the opposition groups are very sceptical about this one. Some of them are just very reluctant to break away from their allies who have links to Al-Qaeda, as the deal requires them to. But many of them also just simply don't believe that the Syrians will do what the Russians are asking, namely that they end the barrel bombing. President Assad today was very clear. He said he wanted to recover the whole of Syria from what he called the terrorists. Now, that doesn't sound like a man about to lay down his arms. There's also the added confusion is that this ceasefire does not apply to all the fighting in Syria. I mean, if there are 7 days of calm, then potentially we could see the United States and Russia coordinating military attacks against the so-called Islamic State group and that other faction with links to Al-Qaeda. So tonight, it's probably too early to assess whether it's actually holding. There is clearly some violence still taking place, but people were expecting that. I think the question will come, what does this sustain over the next few days? So likely to be some reduction in violence? Yes. Is there likely to be some humanitarian aid going in? Yes. Is this the beginning end of the conflict? I think very, very unlikely.
OK, James again. Thanks very much. James Landale there for us. Well, David Cameron is to leave the House of Commons. His decision to resign as an MP comes barely 2 months after he stood down as Prime Minister following his defeat in the EU referendum. At the time, he said he'd continue as a backbench MP. But now he's concerned about being a distraction and said he wanted to remove any risk of causing any difficulties for Theresa May's government. Our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, has more details. There's some flash photography in the report.
Not just out of number 10, but out of politics too. Despite the promise he would go on, David Cameron is walking away from Westminster. Friends say he doesn't want to be a backseat driver and make life harder for Theresa May.
With modern politics, with the circumstances of my resignation, it isn't really possible to be a proper backbench MP as a former Prime Minister. I think everything you do will become a big distraction and a big diversion from what the government needs to do for our country.
No Tory leader had ever posed with huskies before, but no Tory leader had ever put such a premium on changing their party. And it took them back to power, albeit through the early coalition love-in. That Rose Garden moment, some came to regret.
Being a Prime Minister of a coalition is quite different to being a Prime Minister of a single-party government, because it requires a lot of give and take, it requires negotiation, it requires an ability to persuade people of your point of view and to listen to other people who don't share your point of view. And I think he did all of those things, and he did those things with great skill.
Before, after a decade as Tory leader, winning outright just last year, taking on Labour opponent number 4.
This is a change of life for him. It's the end of one political period, the opening of another one, and I think we should just respect people when they move on to do something else in their lives.
But the headline of David Cameron's chapter in history will be promising and then losing his referendum gamble.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
Transforming the UK's place in the world, turning politics upside down.
Just as Tony Blair will be remembered in history as the man who took us into Iraq, David Cameron will be remembered as the man who accidentally took us out of Europe. That's very sad.
Friends deny he's flounced out because he doesn't agree with the new boss. But there's a real danger, they admit. Anything he said could drive a wedge. And David Cameron himself accepts they differ.
Obviously, I'm going to have my own views about different issues. People would know that. And that's really the point. As a former Prime Minister, it is very difficult, I think, to sit as a backbencher and not be an enormous diversion and distraction from what the government's doing.
He was sometimes accused of believing his own hype.
Nothing is really impossible if you put your mind to it. After all, as I once said, I was the future once.
Such recent history feels already so much in the past.
Let's go live to Westminster and talk to Laura, who's there. He talks about diversions and distractions, Laura. Is that because he foresaw disagreements coming up with Theresa May's government?
Well, Hugh, I think there's certainly an element of that. That is part of the reason for David Cameron's final U-turn. Theresa May's government has, I think, looked more different and more of a departure from David Cameron's previous administration than many Tories expected. She was pretty ruthless in clearing out his coterie, and she has been absolutely unafraid of distancing herself from him, junking some of his ideas. And I think, bluntly, it would have been pretty hard for David Cameron to support wholeheartedly every proposal she was putting forward, every idea that she had. Some people in his political circle are pretty cross about the way the new administration has behaved, but they deny that David Cameron's gone off in a strop here because he doesn't agree with what she's been getting up to. And I think, as with any big decision in life, there's a mixture of motivations. Being a former anything, whether former Prime Minister, former leader or former minister, is pretty difficult around here. Any raised eyebrow, any absence from a crucial vote could have been interpreted or misinterpreted in a way that might have made life very difficult for Theresa May. And I think David Cameron genuinely did not want that to happen. And at the end of the day, though, politicians are an ambitious breed. If you've had the top job and it slips away, maybe the motivation for putting in the hours, maybe that slips away too.
All right, Laura. Thanks very much again. Laura Kuenssberg there for us at Westminster. Well, the government's controversial plans for new grammar schools in England have been set out in Parliament. All state schools would be able to select pupils by academic ability if there was a demand for it, but there would be conditions attached. New grammar schools would have to ensure a share of places went to pupils from low-income backgrounds, and pupils would be able to enter at 14 and at 16 years of age, as well as at 11. They would also have to offer help to non-selective schools. Our education editor, Branwen Jeffries, has been studying the detail.
What do you think is going to happen?
Suddenly that question is so much harder to answer. This is one of the 4 grammar schools in Southend. The Essex Borough kept these academically selective schools, and now pupils travel as far as 20 or 30 miles to study here.
There is a lot of demand for grammar school education. Parents value it, the students value it, and they're willing to make the sacrifice, for want of a better word, to actually come to the school.
Here they want to see the detail, but they will consider opening another school.
This isn't the only grammar school that's oversubscribed. It's not unusual for grammar school pupils to travel quite long distances. Their parents want the option of a highly academic education, and that's the political calculation behind this policy.
When we talk about selection in this country, we have to acknowledge that we now have selection by house price already. For those who are able to buy a house in the catchment area of the best schools.
Under Labour we had education, education, education. This government's mantra is segregation, segregation, segregation.
Just up the Thames from Southend, Tilbury is built around its docks. Local councillors say they'd welcome grammar schools, but not all here are so sure.
My brother went to a grammar school years and years ago, but it does split the kids up a bit, doesn't it, you know?
You seem to learn a lot from there, you know, and I think you're more or less guaranteed that whatever you're going to learn there, you're going to get it. You know, you're going to get your qualifications in it, you know?
What if a 10-year-old comes to you and goes, Mum, I failed? That's a 10-year-old saying she's failed. It's not right. They're too young.
Schools here are already struggling to raise standards. So today, questions from senior Tories about how the impact would be managed.
Will she accept that it will be tested by how far she can, in specific ways, ensure that this change does not damage the opportunities for any people in other schools?
From another former Education Secretary, less support than a warning.
That in the face of the opposition to all reform and all debate from the dogmatists on that side of the House, she will be driven entirely by data and what works.
Most secondary schools in England are run by academy trusts. Today, one of the biggest, which runs almost 50 schools, said they won't bring back selection because they don't believe it will close the gap between rich and poor.
We believe in opportunity for all. We believe that no child should be left behind. We believe that every child matters. And a return to the failed policy of grammar schools from our past is just not the way to get there.
As we come through the gates, we're going to call for the ball.
These plans will have to get past many opponents to get off the ground, not just from the official opposition parties, but backbench Tory MPs and wary academy school bosses. Branwen Jeffries, BBC News.
Now, following Hillary Clinton's admission that she's been treated for pneumonia, her Republican opponent, Donald Trump, says he's been right to make health an issue in the presidential campaign. Mrs. Clinton was forced to leave yesterday's 9/11 memorial event in New York when she apparently felt unwell, and she's cancelled a campaign visit to California. Our North America editor, John Sopel, looks at the likely impact of this health question on the Clinton campaign.
Good morning, America. It's 8 a.m. Hillary Clinton's health.
There's only one topic of conversation today in America, and it's Hillary Clinton's health. How serious is her condition? What impact will it have on the race? How long will she be laid up with pneumonia?
It can run the full gamut, from relatively mild, walking pneumonia, if you will, all the way to being critically ill, being in the intensive care unit, requiring a breathing tube.
And what about the prognosis?
Excellent. As long as she's being treated appropriately with the proper antibiotics, it seems like she will make a full recovery.
No flowers or grapes, but there was this from Donald Trump.
Hope she gets well soon. I don't know what's going on. I'm
like you, I see what I see. The coughing fit was a week ago, so I assume that was pneumonia also.
I've been talking so...
The coughing fit came in Cleveland last week, though she did her best to make a joke of it.
Every time I think about Trump, I get allergic.
And yesterday too, after her collapse, she tried to make light of it all.
Great. What happened? It's a beautiful day in New York.
But it would be hours before her team would admit that she had pneumonia, even though the diagnosis had come days earlier. And on social media, even friends have been critical. This is David Axelrod, who was Barack Obama's campaign manager in 2008. Antibiotics can take care of pneumonia. What's the cure for an unhealthy penchant for privacy that repeatedly creates unnecessary problems? And today the campaign admitted to being at fault.
It took us a bit to get that information together to release a statement. And in retrospect, I think we should have provided more information more quickly.
And so a new twist in the race for the White House. Health is now a major issue. And though it may sound trivial to talk about the lack of openness with which her illness was communicated, it feeds into a narrative. Whether it be about her email server, money raised by the Clinton Foundation, there's a sense there is a lack of transparency. And Hillary Clinton can't afford to give voters new reasons to doubt her. But that she did at the weekend when she described millions of Trump supporters thus.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
Well, thank you very much.
And today Trump hit back.
While Hillary Clinton lives a sequestered life behind gates and walls and guards, she mocks and demeans hardworking Americans who only want their own families to enjoy a fraction of the security enjoyed by our politicians.
In this seesawing battle, it's Donald Trump's campaign which seems to be in rude health, while Hillary Clinton's is spluttering. Well, Hillary Clinton is due back out on the road on Wednesday when she's meant to be going to Las Vegas. And then in 2 weeks' time, you've got the first presidential debate, which is seen as crucial to both the candidates. Hillary Clinton has just tweeted, "Thanks to everyone who's reached out with well wishes. I'm feeling fine and getting better." But an awful lot of people on social media are saying, look, if you can't cope with a memorial service, how are you going to manage the pressures of being in the White House? That may not be fair. But who said politics was fair? Hugh.
John, thanks very much for the latest there on the campaign. John Sopel, our North America editor. Detectives investigating the murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence in southeast London 23 years ago have launched a new witness appeal after the DNA of an unknown woman was found near to where he was killed. The DNA was found on the strap of a bag found close to the murder scene. Police don't believe the woman was involved in the attack, but may be a valuable witness. They think the strap was left by Stephen Lawrence's attackers, might have been part of an improvised weapon. The General Secretary of the TUC, Frances O'Grady, has condemned what she called greedy companies which treat workers like animals. Speaking at their annual conference in Brighton, she singled out employers who declared their workforce to be self-employed to evade laws on pay and conditions. Our industry correspondent John Moylan reports now from Brighton.
Jonathan Katona is a courier for a delivery firm. Rain or shine, he works 10 hours a day. But because he's self-employed, he misses out on some workers' rights. So when he was off sick recently, he didn't get paid.
It's branded to me as flexibility, but what it really means is job insecurity. It means that I'm unable to, I have to save up for when I'm ill, when I'm on holiday. It simply means that I'm on my own, and my company does nothing to help.
The growth of insecure work is a new front line for trade unions. A long campaign at Sports Direct forced the company to end 0 hours contracts in its stores. And now the delivery firm Hermes is in the spotlight amid claims that its couriers make less than the minimum wage. It's now facing a possible inquiry into its working practices. So today at Congress, the head of the TUC had this warning for rogue firms.
Any greedy business that treats its workers like animals, you're next.
If you run a big brand with a dirty little secret, a warehouse where people don't even get paid the minimum wage, a fleet of couriers who are slaves to the app, let us put them on notice. We're on our way, delegates. We're coming for them.
But for some, casual work isn't a problem. Hi, Steve.
Hello.
Steve Rowe is a driver with the taxi firm Uber. He likes being self-employed and is relaxed about not having those basic rights.
I don't want to be a worker. I want to be independent. I want to be able to drive when I want to drive. I want to be able to work on my projects when I want to work on my projects. And with the Uber platform, I have total flexibility.
Self-employment is growing, as is the number of people who say that they're on 0 hours contracts. So unions here know that protecting workers in this so-called gig economy, where people juggle a number of insecure jobs, well, that's becoming increasingly important. John Moylan, BBC News, Brighton.
Well, it's been another successful day for Britain's Paralympians in Rio. Will Bailey overcame his disappointment in 2012 and a crowd backing his Brazilian opponent today to win gold in the table tennis, while Aled Davis set a record in his shot put category. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss has the details.
If you've ever wondered what being Paralympic champion means, well, here's the answer. Will Bailey was born with a condition which restricts the movement of his limbs. But when he was 7, his grandmother bought him a table tennis table, and this is where it's led him. He was up against Brazil's Israel Stroh and most of the crowd. But after silver in London, it was gold.
He's done it now! Will Bailey!
And what a celebration. Bailey's clambering onto the table earned him a yellow card. Not that he seemed to mind. A hug for the umpire, followed by something even more exuberant for his coach. He later told me it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream.
I've given everything, to try and win a gold medal, and I mean everything. I've been having blisters on my feet for years and years and years, and going to bed thinking I'm never going to achieve my dreams. I can live my life knowing that I've done something which I thought maybe could never happen.
Meanwhile, a sweltering day proved the sweetest for Aled Davis, one of the stars of London 2012 with a new Paralympic record in the shot put and another gold to add to Britain's ever-expanding collection. On Sunday, they won 8, their best day so far, finished off by the flashing blades of Richard Whitehead as he charged to the 200 metres. And behind him, former Army captain Dave Henson, just 5 years after losing his legs in an explosion in Afghanistan, a barely believable bronze. Another of yesterday's champions says in this British team, success is inspiring success.
I remember on Friday night, coming back from my event, and then there's a slow motion of Johnny Peacock coming through the line and stuff, and he's one, and you saw Richard Whitehead and a few others that kind of added to this thing, and the swimmers are doing it as well, and it's it just leads to more and more and more, and it's you just want to be part of the club.
And hoping to join that club, the youngest member of the British team, Abby Kane, only turned 13 last month. But the visually impaired swimmer reached her 400 metres final. Although at the top of the screen she had to settle for 6th, it was a personal best and some debut. And still to come in the pool, one of the British team's most famous names. Earlier, Ellie Simmonds broke the Paralympic record on her way to the final of the individual medley. After gold in London, could it be a Rio repeat? Yes, Ellie Simmonds goes for gold at around 20 to midnight your time. She will start as the favourite, but let's have a look at the medals table as things stand. Britain there in 2nd place behind China with 25 gold medals, and with 6 days still remaining here, they'll be expecting plenty more to come, Hugh.
Andy, thanks very much. Andy Swiss there with the latest the Paralympic Games in Rio. Well, one of the BBC's most successful and popular programmes, The Great British Bake Off, is to move to Channel 4. The independent company which makes the programme, Love Productions, has signed a 3-year deal with Channel 4. Love Productions had told staff that they'd been unable to reach agreement with the BBC, but the BBC said there were limits to what it could pay, and it had made a very strong offer to keep the programme. Our correspondent, David Silito, has the story.
The winner of the 2015 Great British Bake Off is...
It is the BBC's biggest show, a baking competition that's beaten all comers.
Nadia!
15 million people watched Nadia win last year's Bake Off, but it's now off to Channel 4.
It's a pretty bad day for the BBC because the BBC have nurtured and supported a show that I don't think any other broadcaster would have done and turned it into this massive hit. It's kind of become part of British culture.
The Bake Off negotiations have been going on for about a year now, but today was the final meeting. The BBC's offer was rejected and Love Productions went down the road and signed a 3-year deal with Channel 4.
In a statement this evening, they said Channel 4 is very proud to be the new home for the Great British Bake Off and added, "I'm delighted we've been able to partner with the hugely talented team at Love Productions." And of course, it's not the first big programme the BBC has lost recently. Top Gear has gone to Amazon, Channel 4 took over Formula 1, and The Voice has gone to ITV. But does it matter to viewers?
Joe!
One former Bake Off winner feels so long as it's the same show, fine. But others?
I did a poll on my Facebook and my other social media, and lots of people were, really outraged that it's moving, and my gut feeling was, a bit of shock to begin with. Oh no, how have the Beeb let that go? And now I've got my head around it, I'm a little bit calmer.
Channel 4 will begin with a celebrity bake-off next year. The presenters? They've only just been told. Negotiations are yet to begin. But when this year's champion is finally revealed, it really will be a showstopper for the BBC. David Silotto, BBC News.
Quick reminder that Newsnight's about to come up on BBC Two. Here's Kirsty.
Tonight, as the Syria ceasefire begins, an exclusive interview with a spokesman of the jihadi group formerly known as Nusra Front, who are still a target for US and Russian warplanes. And how on earth did the BBC manage to lose the Great British Bake Off to Channel 4? Join me now at BBC Two, 11 o'clock in Scotland.
That's Newsnight with Kirsty here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.